All right, this is going to be a fun one. Today we're going to be talking about tools. I have lots of material to cover, and I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. I apologize for nothing.
Welcome to the Altered Call podcast. My name is Alex Pillischafske. I want to thank you for joining me on these introductory episodes. I hope that you enjoyed this overview of the material coming soon.
When I refer to tools in this podcast, what I'm referring to are ideas or processes that you can use to simplify or streamline your life. These tools are not necessary in any way, but if you're going to create extra capacity, then an understanding of how these tools work will help significantly in that process. What I want to do right here is give a general overview of what I'm referring to with each specific tool so that you can know what I'm talking about. The ones that I want to cover today include framework, filter, belief, standard, lens, bias, and the sandbox. All right, let's start with bias because that's one of my favorite ideas, and I think it's something that's a little bit misunderstood in our current society. A bias is a prejudice for or against something. That's it. You have hundreds or thousands of biases, and most of them you don't have any idea exist in your thought process. What your brain does from the day you are born is it starts ranking things that you like and ranking things that you don't like, and it creates this massive list. And a bias just means that it's higher or lower on that list. Let's take an example here. I am biased against cats. I don't particularly like them. So if you ask me, hey, do you want to meet my cat? The answer, in my brain, without me even thinking about it, is no. Do I want to meet your dog? Probably. Do I want to meet your baby? Absolutely. Cat? I'm not that interested in. Now, because we have so many biases, people generally don't take the time to rank or even pay attention to them. So a lot of biases are unknown to the people that have them. Where bias gets a bad reputation in our current society is in the realm of news and politics, because media claims constantly that they are not biased when they very clearly are. And that happens on both sides of the spectrum. Is that a problem that journalists or reporters or whatever have a bias? Absolutely not. The problem comes from saying that you don't have a bias when you very clearly do, because people need to be able to see what you're saying and see how it is molded by the biases that you possess. If a reporter says, I have this particular bias and I'm proud of it, here's how this is slanting the story, I think that that's a really good way to operate in the world. In any other case, what we have to do is view someone with an obvious bias through an appropriate lens. All right, moving on to a lens. A lens is used to look at something in a different way than you normally would, or in a different way than it is intended to be viewed. Continuing with the example of the news media, you can simply look at it through the lens of this particular media company supports this particular political agenda with this particular bias. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at it through a lens that acknowledges that bias and attempts to moderate anything that they say in the other direction. Now, I will freely admit that there are two better scenarios here. The first is that they remove their bias entirely from their reporting and allow you to take everything at face value and come to your own conclusions. The second better scenario would be to acknowledge their bias and how that bias is shaping the way that they're telling the story. Given that neither of those things happen, it is necessary to use a lens to at least get you closer to the truth in a situation where you know you are being manipulated in one direction or the other. All right, let's talk about beliefs for a second. A belief is simply that. It's something that you believe. It does not necessarily have any more weight. Now, you can have strong beliefs or weak beliefs, but ultimately, until you convert them into a standard, they are relatively harmless. Standards are beliefs in action. Let's say you have the belief that you don't like cussing. Wonderful. How is that belief going to impact the world? Well, it's just not. Now, converting it to a standard, you could say, I believe that cussing is bad, so I'm not going to do it. Great, that's a standard that you have for yourself. Or, I believe that cussing is bad, I'm not going to allow my family to do it. Also wonderful. Now, standards can only apply to you or any domain that you control, but they are beliefs that you find necessary to enforce in some sense. One of the things you can do with a standard is you can convert it into something called a filter. What a filter does is it's used to either mitigate certain ideas or eliminate them entirely from your thought process. So let's say, for example, that you have the belief that nothing good happens after midnight. Converting that into a filter, you can say, if anybody invites me over to their house at 1 a.m., I'm just not even going to think about that idea. I'm not going to weigh the pros and the cons. I just don't need to think about this at all because it's something that I've converted into a filter and I will have it automatically removed from my thought process. Framework is probably one of the more complicated ideas here because really what it does is it brings together all of the other ideas and allows you to look at the world in a particular way, such that you can process complex ideas and scenarios as they present themselves to you without your brain exploding. So let's take an example of a framework that I use all the time. Let's say that somebody wants to schedule a meeting with me. Now, I am extraordinarily protective of my time. I don't like giving it away. Doesn't mean that I'm unwilling to, but you really kind of have to earn those slots, and it has to be something that I want to do or I feel particularly drawn to help with. So I start by asking and answering some simple questions. Sometimes I ask these of the person who's requesting the meeting. Sometimes I just run through these in my head as the conversation's going on. But I start with, what do they want? How long will it take? How important is it to me? How urgent is the need? Will I enjoy the meeting? Is it necessary? And how difficult will it be to schedule? All of these questions help me to filter and prioritize the request in such a way that I can determine if it's something that I'm going to do, and to help me determine what I am willing to sacrifice in order to pursue that meeting. Several of my closest friends know that they have permission to step into my calendar pretty aggressively, particularly if it's an urgent situation. If it's somebody who wants to grab coffee and kind of get to know each other, that is also something that I am interested in doing, but it's not something that I'm going to sacrifice a bunch of family time or other high priority work time in order to achieve. So that person is going to get a much narrower section of my schedule. Now, hopefully that meeting can still happen in such a way that it doesn't inconvenience the other things. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to protect my values while maximizing the opportunities that I have. Finally, we get to the idea of a sandbox. I love play, and I'm convinced that if adults played more, that they would just be better all around people. Now, there's a difference between the way that a child plays and the way that I think an adult should play. Children, because they have so much to learn, can really play in any number of ways and have it be productive towards their development. For an adult, what you need to do is cultivate an atmosphere that allows you to develop a certain skill or subset of skills that are going to be valuable to you going forward. So let's say that you're working on your speaking skills. Something like Toastmasters would represent a sandbox for that. It's a place where you can show up, you can speak. Maybe it's on a topic that you want to talk about in the future. Maybe it's on a topic that has no relevance to anything, but it's still developing that skill set that you want to develop. I think that people aren't creative enough ultimately with finding these sandboxes and finding ways to develop these skills in such a way that it doesn't risk the full consequence of failure, because that's the benefit of play. Play allows you to develop skills while still being in a relatively safe environment. And I think that that is just as important for adults as it is for children. All right, we're going to go into more details regarding tools and how to use them as we progress through the material, but I thought that a simple explanation here would at least be useful so that people know what I'm talking about when I use these words. Now, tools don't fix things. You have to know how to use them appropriately and in what scenarios to use them. So don't just go start using all of these things and assume that they're going to help your life. They may or may not. Eventually, what we're going to do is we're going to find the scenarios that are most impacted by these types of tools, and we're going to bring those to bear at that point. So stick with me. We're going to learn how to use these things at a high level as we go. It's going to be really exciting.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Altered Call Podcast. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a review or find links to what I'm doing in the show notes.